Hello, fellow classmates. My name is Jeremiah Terrence, as some of you may already know.
And I'm Christian Sekelic, and today we're going to be discussing the Civil War.
Did you know that the Civil War was the bloodiest 4 years in U.S. history? As we all know, every war consists of a beginning, a middle, and an end.
In describing the beginning, we're going to be discussing the causes and the catalysts to the Civil War.
To describe the middle of the Civil War, we'll be talking about major leaders, battles, and also regular civilian life on both sides.
We're going to associate the end of the Civil War with the Reconstruction period.
Starting off our presentation, we would just like to show you guys a brief video to summarize the Civil War.
One of the most important events in American history, the Civil War, pitted the North against the South. One of the most important events in American history, the Civil War, pitted the North against the South.
All of the issues at stake are the roles in central government, state rights, slavery, and the overall outcome of the Union.
Grim and brutal, the Civil War claimed more American lives than any other past wars.
No other war contains such emotional and philosophical impact. This presentation hopes to describe major events leading to the Civil War, the major events that occurred during the Civil War, and the period of Reconstruction.
The key issues and events that led to the action between the North and South consisted of abolitionism, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott Decision, and the election of 1860.
The North and the South had two completely different views on slavery. The South cherished slavery. The South's income revolved around agriculture, and slavery increased profit dramatically. The North was more industrial and thought that slavery was wrong and harsh. The two completely different mindsets caused differences between the North and the South.
The Missouri Compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state and also admitted Maine as a free state in order to counterbalance the decision. Neither side agreed amongst the decision. This caused tension amongst the Union.
The Compromise of 1850 admitted Texas as a free state. The Utah and New Mexico territory were given the decision through popular sovereignty to decide whether to be a free state or a slave state. The Compromise of 1850 also banned slave trade in Washington, D.C., allowing Utah and New Mexico to decide amongst themselves whether to be a free state or a slave state angered the North because both territories were closer to the South.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act also allowed for popular sovereignty. This caused everyone from the North and the South to flood into Kansas to vote. This led to Bleeding Kansas.
Dred Scott was a slave from the South that was posted in Illinois, a free state. Dred Scott attempted to sue for his freedom. The Supreme Court ruled that African Americans are not citizens, meaning that they do not have the right to sue. They also ruled that Dred Scott is property of his owner and therefore had no choice but to return.
The election of 1860 brought about the idea of ending or continuing slavery. This broke the Union into the North and South. After Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the South felt threatened by the idea of losing slavery. After the election, 7 Southern states seceded, creating the Confederacy.
This ends the causes of the Civil War. As you can see, there were several problems that led to the beginning of the Civil War.
The major battles of the Civil War consisted of the First Battle of Bull Run, the Peninsula Campaign, the Battle of Shiloh, the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Battle of Atlanta, Sherman's March to Sea, and the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse.
The First Battle of Bull Run was fought in July of 1861. It was the first major battle of the Civil War. The Union's forces were slow in positioning themselves, allowing Confederate reinforcements time to arrive by the rail. Each side had about 1,800 poorly trained troops and leaders in their first battle. It was a Confederate victory, followed by a retreat of the Union forces.
The Peninsula Campaign was a Union operation launched in southeastern Virginia from March through July 1862, the first large-scale offensive in the East. The operation was a turning movement against the Confederate States Army in Northern Virginia, intended to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. McClellan was initially successful against General Joseph E. Johnston, but Robert E. Lee turned the subsequent 7 days battle into a humiliating Union defeat.
The Battle of Shiloh was fought April 6 through 7, 1862 in Tennessee. A Union army was encamped at Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee. The Confederate forces launched a surprise attack on Grant's army. Overnight, Grant received considerable reinforcements from another Union army under Major General Don Carlos, allowing him to launch an unexpected counterattack, turning the tide. The next morning, the Union commanders launched a counterattack along the entire line. Confederate forces were forced to retreat from the area, ending their hopes of blocking the Union advance into northern Mississippi.
The Battle of Chancellorsville was a major battle of the American Civil War. It was fought from April 30th to May 6, 1863 in Virginia. Chancellorsville is known as Lee's perfect battle because his risky decision to divide his army in the presence of much larger enemy force resulted in a significant Confederate victory.
The Battle of Gettysburg was fought July 1st through 3rd, 1863, in and around the town of Gettysburg. The battle involved the largest number of casualties in the entire war and is often described as the war's turning point. Union Major General George Meade's Army of Potomac defeated attacks by Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, ending Lee's attempt to invade the North. After his success in Chancellorsville in 1863, Lee led his army through Shenandoah Valley to begin his second invasion of the North. Elements of the two armies initially collided at Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. On the second day of battle, most of both armies had assembled. The Union line was laid out in a defensive formation that resembled a fishhook. In late afternoon of July 2nd, Lee launched a heavy assault on the Union left flank. All across the battlefield, despite significant losses, the Union defenders held their lines. On the third day of battle, fighting resumed. The charge was repulsed at a great loss to the Confederate Army. Lee led his army on a tortuous retreat back to Virginia. Between 46,000 and 51,000 soldiers from both armies were casualties in 3 days of battle.
The Battle of Atlanta was fought during the American Civil War on July 22, 1864, just southeast of Atlanta, Georgia. Continuing their summer campaign to seize the important rail and supply center of Atlanta, Union forces commanded by William T. Sherman defeated Confederate forces. Union Major General was killed during the battle. The city did not fall until September 2, 1864, after a Union siege. After taking the city, Sherman's troops headed south toward Milledgeville and on to Savannah with the March to the Sea. The capture of Atlanta and Hood's burning of military facilities as he evacuated was covered in Northern newspapers, significantly boosting Northern morale, which caused Lincoln to be re-elected by a large margin.
Sherman's March to Sea is the name commonly given to the military Savannah campaign in the American Civil War through Georgia from November 15th to December 21st, 1864, by General Sherman of the Union. The campaign began with Sherman's troops leaving the captured city of Atlanta and ended with the capture of the port of Savannah on December 21st. His forces destroyed military targets as well as industry, infrastructure, and civilian poverty. Sherman's move was known as revolutionary in the ending of the war.
The Battle of Appomattox Courthouse was fought on April 9, 1865. It was the final engagement of Confederate Army before it surrendered to the Union Army. The signing of the surrender documents occurred on April 9th.
In conclusion, the Union has won the war, and this leads us to Reconstruction.
Reconstruction was the period during which the United States began to rebuild after the Civil War and deciding upon how to admit the Confederate States back into the Union. It all started with the Lincoln's 10% plan. Lincoln's plan stated that as 10% of those who had voted in 1860 took an oath of allegiance, a Confederate state could form a new state government.
Soon after Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Jackson became president. This then brought out Johnson's plan for admitting the states back into the Union. Johnson had some same 10% plan as Lincoln, but Johnson excluded high-ranking Confederates as wealthy Southern landowners from taking the oath needed for voting privileges.
This led to the Reconstruction Act of 1867. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 divided Confederate states into 5 different military districts. Confederate states had to ratify the 14th Amendment and give African Americans the right to vote in order to re-enter the Union. Johnson vetoed both the Reconstruction Act of 1867 and the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This led to Johnson almost being kicked out of office.
Giving African American equal rights, there's bound to be an uprising. The Ku Klux Klan was a Southern vigilante group. Their goal was to temporarily destroy the Republican Party, throw out the Reconstruction government, and prevent African Americans from exercising political rights.
Bringing an end to Reconstruction was the election of 1867. During the election, Hayes promised to remove troops from the South. That encouraged the South to vote for Hayes. Once the troops were removed, Reconstruction came to an end.
Well, this concludes our presentation, and I sincerely hope that you took something away from this, and we appreciate you guys for watching.
Thank you.
All right.
Grim and brutal, the Civil War claimed more American lives than any other war. Dang, man. The election of 1860 brought about the idea of continuing the Civil War claimed more American lives than any other past wars.
No other war contained such emotional and physical.
Reconstruction was the period during which the United States began to rebuild after the Civil War. What? How to admit the Confederate States back into the Union. It all started with Lincoln's 10% plan. Lincoln's what is was the period during which the United States began to rebuild after the Civil War. And deciding why you're looking at your paper. Reconstruction was the period during which the United States began to rebuild after the Civil War. Reconstruction was the period during which the United States began to
received considerable reinforcements from another Union Army under Major General Don Carlos Buell, allowing them to launch an unexpected counterattack during the times. The next morning, the Union commanders launched a counterattack along the entire line. Confederate forces were forced to retreat from the area, ending their hopes of blocking the Union advance into northern Mississippi. The Battle of Gettysburg was fought July 1st through 3rd. The Battle of Gettysburg. Barack Obama does not care about white people. Not all black people like watermelon.